Hey guys, welcome back. So now we are getting into the conclusion of What If Spider-Man, Spider's Shadow. And man, this story has been a roller coaster. Like Spider Manslaughter has just been wonderful. But with that said, let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so we're getting into part 5 of Spider's Shadow, after Peter had faced off with Ben Grimm to where he knocked him outside so that everyone else out there could help, but as it turned out, this plan, it just didn't pan out too well, because it then caused everyone else who was outside to then be taken under the influence of Peter's symbiote. And it's kind of a weird thing that I want to talk about for just a second here. Because in the case of that modified symbiote that was on Ben, spreading out and taking over all the heroes that were out there, like with the way that this is done, it isn't like your conventional symbiote offspring. Because even with the lab symbiote that we saw, that was created and placed on the Ben Grimm, it was more like a gas-like form. And even when we saw it take a hold of Ben, it wasn't like your conventional symbiote situation. But I say this because I want you to keep in mind that these different variants that Peter's symbiote has created, that they're pretty much brought to you by the intelligence of Reed Richards, which practically means that these things are modified with whatever technology or discoveries that Reed Richards has come across. And this is practically what allows your single variant to jump from one host and spread out to like a dozen. But with that said, just keep in mind that these aren't one-to-one symbiotes, but instead each instance, whether it be what we saw in Ben Grimm or the huge one that covered the whole Baxter building, they're all just modified extensions of Peter's symbiote. And we'll talk about more of the details of how that works in just a little bit. But with the symbiote taking control of the heroes and bringing them in after Peter, his spider sense is going crazy, and when he sees them come in, he reaches out to Johnny to get MJ out of the building. But then when we jump over to Johnny, it's here where Peter's symbiote recognizes MJ from the different images in Peter's mind that we'd seen before when it was trying to bond with Peter, that it remembers her from Peter's mind, and she was the reason why Peter could never fully complete the symbiosis, because his love for her was holding him back. But it's like when MJ hears this, like all she really hears is like, Peter loves me, and she really just gets caught up off those words, man, like right now, here. But the symbiote tells her like it only sees her as an obstacle that's in the way of Peter being a quote better version of himself. But when this happens, Johnny swoops in because he's like, man, you know, this sounds like the part where MJ dies, so let me get her out of here. Because also she ain't doing nothing but standing there like she just waiting to get killed too. But it's here when this happens where Johnny does like Peter said and he gets MJ out of there. And with doing so, your symbiote Reed Richards is right after them. But also when Johnny and MJ leave, Peter notices that his spider sense calms down, so he hits Johnny like what's happening, and it's here where he finds out that not only has a symbiote left with Reed Richards, but also all the other heroes that are being controlled, they're following his symbiote too, leaving Peter by himself in the Baxter building. To where from there, Johnny pretty much tells them that he's bought Peter some time and that Peter needs to use that time and make his way up to Reed's lab so that he can look around and hopefully find a way to finish this. And in the meantime, while Peter's looking in the lab, Johnny will just do everything he can to keep MJ safe. But then while Peter's here, next we jump over to Sue Richards, who had actually called for Alicia Masters or Alicia Grimm, and I'm not really sure if her and Ben are married yet at this point, but Sue had called Alicia over for her to pick up Franklin and get him out of there since there was this emergency at the Baxter building. But also with Alicia arriving here when she did, it was pretty much perfect timing because this also created the scenario to where Sue had to take Franklin and leave the other heroes, which is also why she wasn't taken control of like everyone else. But as soon as she hands off Franklin, it's here where she looks up and she sees Johnny carrying Mary Jane while being chased by symbiote Reed and the other heroes. But then also it's here where we see the symbiote speaking through the heroes by way of Captain America, who with a group of others just coming from the side, catching Johnny off guard. But with this happening, they're coordinating under the control of Peter's symbiote while it's using Reed's body, which also shows us that this is like a version of a hive mind control thing going on. But with Johnny getting hit with Cap's shield, he drops MJ, but fortunately Sue catches her, like just in time because MJ was nearly donezo. But even with her catching MJ, Sue and Johnny are struggling to hold these guys off. They're just ridiculously outnumbered. But back over at the Baxter building, you then had the case of Peter, who's pulled up Reed's research along with the history of what his symbiote had put together in order to modify these different parts of itself. And as it turns out, what Peter finds is that the symbiote had only taken elements of itself and mixed them with Reed's unstable molecule formula. And so like as far as the unstable molecule formula, or really just unstable molecules, this is something that goes back all the way to Fantastic Four Volume 1, because unstable molecules were just the idea or the concept behind the suits of the Fantastic Four, which were also affected by their cosmic incident. So when Reed stretched, his suit would also stretch and not tear, and when Johnny set flame on, his suit wouldn't just burn up. Sue's clothes can turn invisible along with her, and for Ben Grimm, like his underwear just wouldn't tear, I guess. But then after this sometime, and I'm not sure exactly when, but the unstable molecules formula, it was essentially just repeating this process with other materials, which in most cases will be other superheroes' uniforms. But with unstable molecules essentially performing in a way to where they react to a base material or subject, in this case is pieces of the symbiote, which from there are being controlled in like a hive mind. But with seeing this, Peter figures out that if he stops his symbiote, then all the others will stop reacting and everyone else will be set free. But with Peter still trying to figure out like how to pull this off, he then finds a device in the lab that belongs to Ben, and all of a sudden, boom, that's it. He figures it out, and he immediately tells Johnny to lose Reed and buy them some time, which he does, causing him to leave with MJ, but with doing so, leaving Sue Richards on her own. And when this happens, like your symbiote Reed and the others, they try to follow Johnny, but Sue, she's not having that. But just when she gives Johnny a head start, Thor then comes in and he smashes Sue's psionic force field with Mjolnir. And when this happens, she's then taken off guard and scooped up by the symbiote, who then takes her back to the Baxter building in order to use her as a bargaining chip in order to get Peter to just give up and turn himself over. Because at this point, with the symbiote no longer knowing where MJ is, threatening Sue is like option number 2. But when they get back to the Baxter building, it sees Peter climb up to the roof, and it tells Peter not to try anything because it's stronger now, and at this point Peter wouldn't be able to resist if he wanted to. But then it's here where he tells the symbiote that that's not what you want, because really the symbiote would rather for the two of them to bond willingly, and it's because of that where Peter makes an offer to where the symbiote lets MJ live and it lets the other heroes go, then he'll willingly turn himself over and allow the symbiote to bond with him again. And the symbiote agrees, but it's here where he tells Peter that this one is too smart, and because of that the symbiote can't let him live. And right away the symbiote just kills Reed Richards. And with this happening right in front of his face, the pain of watching is like almost unbearable. But after killing Reed and throwing his body out the roof like it was nothing, Peter then jumps back down into the lab, and the symbiote chases right behind him. And the symbiote tells him that it knows that there's nothing in this lab that could hurt it because it made sure of that before it left. But when the symbiote chased him and caught up, like as soon as it touched Peter, it then quickly realized that this is not Peter at all, but instead this was Johnny, who was wearing Ben Grimm's image inducer, which is a device that Reed had made for Ben after the incident, with him feeling guilty about not being able to reverse Ben's condition. So at one point Reed had made the image inducer so that Ben could walk around and look human. But in this case, with Johnny showing up on the roof looking like Peter, he lured the symbiote right into the oven and cranked that thing up, cooking the whole lab, but in the process also freeing all the other heroes, to whom some of which may have had a long fall. It's kind of hard to say. But even with this happening and it being wrapped up, you still have a number of things that need to be sorted through. Because with all the deaths that we've seen throughout this story, like things just can't go back to normal. And with that being the case, we do get a bit of extra context to kind of show us where things land. To where first we then go into Eddie Brock, who's still recovering from that last bout with Spider-Man and Eddie's temporary moment with posing as Brock Ock. But it's here where Jameson goes to see Eddie, and Jameson, of all people, tells Eddie that he needs to let go of his hatred for Spider-Man. Now, I know we in an alternate reality, but with Jameson saying this, he admits that he had to do this himself. And really what it stemmed from was making Spider-Man out to be like this figure, or this boogeyman as he would say, as if Spider-Man were the cause of all his problems. But really Jameson had also come to this realization when he realized that underneath it all, Spider-Man was just a man. But with saying this, Jameson also realizes that this is exactly what Eddie's going through. And it's here where he offers his support to Eddie, because he knows this process of letting go is not really just going to happen overnight. But then he also lets Eddie know that he's been in contact with his lawyer and he's going to testify on Eddie's behalf to help him out. And regardless of what turns up with Eddie killing Otto Octavius, Jameson still lets Eddie know that he's not alone. But in the case of Peter, who everybody knows is Spider-Man, he's still got a body count that's stacked pretty high. But because a number of the other heroes were also taken over by the overall influence of his symbiote, their testimonies helped Peter in a huge way, to where ultimately it was a quick trial and he was found not guilty on all charges. But even with Peter being acquitted, it was like bittersweet, because sure, he gets to keep his freedom, but he still feels horrible about everything that happened. And MJ helps him out by telling him that all he can really do is just do his best and push towards happiness when he can. And And with hearing MJ say this, like, it helps, but then Peter's also thinking like, man, there ain't no way I can go back out there as Spider-Man. And with him thinking this, I can't help but to think myself, like, he's right. Because if there's one thing that's stickier than Peter literally climbing up a wall, it's the name Spider-Manslaughter. Like, that name is going nowhere. So he can go ahead and just forget about that. But then while they're here, it isn't too much long after to where they're then approached by Sue Richards. And when she gets there, she asks MJ to give her and Peter a minute. And when she does, she tells Peter that her, Ben, and Johnny, that they know that Reed's death wasn't Peter's fault. But also that up until now, she hadn't been responding to Peter's messages, mainly because the three of them had just been putting the pieces back together. But then she also tells Peter that she knows that he's no stranger to tragedy, much like her and the team when they went through the incident that gave them their powers. And it's here where she tells Peter that Reed had almost died from the guilt from Ben being turned into the Thing, but instead of giving into that tragedy and that guilt, Reed turned all of it around when he made them heroes. And it was through this where Reed showed her that you have to look on the other side of tragedy and find meaning. And with her telling this to Peter, she offers for her family to take their tragedy and Peter to take his guilt, and for them all to find a way to get through it together, which from here in this universe, this then sets up the start of Peter joining the Fantastic Four. But then aside from this, we then have like this post-credit scene, right? Which in this case is really more so an epilogue, but just with the way that it starts, it feels like a post-credit scene. Because when it starts off, we see Wilson Fisk pretty much standing in the same spot that we had first seen him within this series looking out on the city, but then it's here where he's approached by his scientists or his doctors who say they got news back from the lab. But when they approach him, he doesn't even want to hear it because he is disgusted that Peter Parker has never truly paid for his crimes. And on top of that, Peter Parker is still out there and operating like a free man and doing that in a city that belongs to the Kingpin. But with them saying this, James Wesley, who's Kingpin's attorney, and also like his white-collar right-hand man in the sense of organized crime, but Wesley tells Fisk that they need to focus on his health. But at this point, Fisk isn't worried about that. He says all that matters is destroying Peter Parker, and that's all that he cares about, even if he falls apart waiting for it to happen. But then it's here where Wesley tells him that the doctors are proposing that he doesn't have to choose between getting better or destroying Peter Parker, because of with what they found, he can have both. And it's like we're just left with that, like that cliffhanger at the conclusion, but also with what appears to be one of the symbiote creations which were recovered after the destruction of Reed's lab. And it's a crazy cliffhanger, man. Like, this needs to be a series because there's so much more that could happen from here. But also if it leads to Kingpin getting a symbiote, like we've seen that happen before, and I did a video on it like a while back, but whether if that's what it comes to again, or if we see Eddie take the symbiote and more or less leave Wilson Fisk to die because Eddie just can't let go, like either way I'm here for it, man. Because also if Peter's symbiote did survive somehow, it would be a whole nother beast with it containing Reed Richards' memory. But we'll see if anything pans out. Fingers crossed. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below so you can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below or over on Discord, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.